This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins. In this time of millennial reflection, we felt it was important to do a show about Shakespeare, and we are very honored to have a man who knows so much about him. Here to introduce him, my co-host, Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
Harold Bloom is a prominent scholar and I dare say an expert reader of Shakespeare. He has a terrific new book out called Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. And Mr. Bloom is our guest tonight on Theater Talk. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, if I read you correctly, the premise of your book is that Shakespeare created, not unearthed, not articulated the best of anyone else, but created what it is to be a human being, as we know modern man is today. Is that correct?
Well, that's an eloquent overstatement.
Thank you.
That's you.
Dr. Johnson, whom I revere, said the essence of poetry is invention, by which he meant, in a sense, recreation or discovery. And if Shakespeare is, as he rather clearly is, the most eminent of all poets, someone who, after all, wrote not only the best verse, but the best prose in the English language. To speak of Shakespeare as an inventor and his work as an invention is not a hyperbole. The question of what precisely the human is at any particular time is always, of course, open to extraordinary disagreement and debate. But Shakespeare most certainly, and not just in terms of the drama, but subsequently because of his enormous effect upon the novel, and indeed every mode of literature, and indeed every mode of talking about human beings, which transcends, after all, imaginative literature. Shakespeare can be said to have thoroughly reformulated our notion of what human character is. To go just a step beyond that, pretty much can be said to have invented personality in the sense in which it has been taken, that is to say, pathos, as compared to ethos, in the last 4 centuries or so. That, I think, is not a hyperbolical statement. People in Homer, people in the Bible, people in Chaucer, certainly, they age and they die.
And they change. I mean, one
they
of the
change because they, well, before Shakespeare, they change, but they change in their relationship to the gods or to God. They don't necessarily change in relationship to themselves. And they do not necessarily change inwardly. Indeed, the very notion of an inner or inward self, let alone a perpetually growing inner self, is essentially Shakespearean. It's very difficult to find any even moderately full-scale version of it before Shakespeare. I must say, my talking along these lines in the book ran into a great deal of resistance among reviewers and others. But that's, I think, because of the rather peculiar relationship that all of us, no matter what we do, stand in to Shakespeare. He is, as it were, the container. We are the things contained. He is a larger form of thought and of the successful representation of pathos, of emotion, than any other that we know. And to a remarkable degree, he has molded us. He has molded us even if we haven't read him, which is a very curious phenomenon.
Yes.
I think Shakespeare's vocabulary is, if I remember properly, something like 23,000 words, which is in itself an outrage, because no other author from antiquity to the present day has such a vocabulary. The shocking thing about that vocabulary is that half of the words are used only once. I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about connectives and,
Right.
but, for, and so on. But of words, qua words, half are used only once, as if to say, having found the perfect or appropriate context for the word, he chose never to use it again. And of course, another shocking proportion of the words, I think about 1,500 of them altogether, are his own coinage and have passed into the language. So even linguistically, we are in a very peculiar relationship to him, one that we cannot quite estimate. But more profoundly, we are inside him, rather than even he being inside us. Obviously, I'm talking metaphorically. There was a very splendid British critic I used to correspond with when I was much younger, now long dead, named Owen Barfield, who once said quite remarkably, I think it was in his book on poetic diction, that it can be embarrassing for us when we come to realize that what we want to consider our own emotions are actually Shakespeare's thoughts. That is really not only an accurate statement on Barfield's part, but a very disconcerting kind of a statement.
Mm-hmm. In what way?
Well, if the emotions that you want to feel as being very much your own were in fact thought up by an author who precedes you by 4 centuries.
He's writing your life.
Yeah, in some curious sense, he is doing the thinking and the feeling for you, and you never quite catch up to him. That really does make him a unique phenomenon.
You speak of him almost as though he were a god.
Oh, I'm not at all embarrassed at the thought, of saying that if there is, as it were, what the old Hermetists would have called a mortal god, it might as well be William Shakespeare. I mean, there are obviously extraordinary figures in the history of Western consciousness, from Plato to Shakespeare's contemporary Montaigne, and on to Freud in the century just ended, who are amazing phenomena, but his difference in the end from all other writers, from all other thinkers, from anyone who has used language in a form that has come down to us, his difference is extraordinary because they cannot, in fact, as any logician, would tell one, there cannot be a difference in kind, only a difference in degree between writers or those who use language. But you can have a difference in degree so enormous that pragmatically it does become a difference in kind. There is an essay by Goethe, who was profoundly involved with Shakespeare, and at the same time, I think on a very deep level, affronted by Shakespeare. You might say he experienced a certain anguish of contamination or even anxiety of influence in regard to Shakespeare. But nevertheless, it's a marvelous essay, and it's called Shakespeare und keine Ende, which means, in effect, no end to Shakespeare, no way of coming to the end of it. This is, I suppose, what used to be called bardolatry. But if I consider what is being done on our stages now in Shakespearean productions, when I consider what is being done in universities and colleges in the English-speaking world,
it's bard travesty.
In the supposed teaching of Shakespeare, it's not just travesty. It seems to be a kind of positive animus against him, an attempt to degrade him, to bring him down to the level of other other writers.
You speak in your book that university professors speak of Shakespeare in the same terms that they use to describe television or Madonna. So trivializing it.
Yes, many of them do.
I see your book in some ways as an attempt to almost rescue Shakespeare from what is being done to him
No,
in the universities and on stages today.
Well, you know, he doesn't need rescue because he will rescue himself. It does not matter. I mean, it's too bad that young readers are, as it were, being turned away from him by the way he is being taught. It is very much too bad that playgoers have to submit to the absurdities that high concept directors supposedly inflict upon them. These things are indeed too bad. I don't think they greatly matter. He is perfectly indestructible. He is more prevalent today than he was 20 years ago, and as I remark at one point in the book, you can't get rid of him any more than you can get rid of yourself.
He is indestructible even in the hands of the public theater, which has given us some dreadful productions over the years. But I want to ask you, what...
You know, you can argue it both ways. I have good friends, you know, like Richard Howard, the poet and translator, who say to me, and he said in quite a nice, generous review of my book that was published somewhere, I forget where, Richard remarked that, you know, it's too bad that Harold has acquired Charles Lamb's anti-theatrical prejudice, as it were, because, you know, you can learn something even from the most terrible stage production of Shakespeare. I suppose you can, you know.
I learned something from the Comedy of Errors,
No.
which was really
that was the rap version of the Comedy of Errors.
I have no comment on that whatsoever.
We thought it would be fun to take you to see that after this shoot today.
I think at one point in this book, you know, I cried out, you know, from the heart for more of what people like Clear Bloom and Brian Bedford have been doing. They've been going around together and doing readings from Shakespeare.
Yes, you do, yes.
And in fact, well, as I say in the book, when I was a boy of, I guess 16, back in 1946, I was overwhelmed by Rafe Richardson as Falstaff at the old city center with the old Vic, doing part one in the matinee and part two in the evening, with Olivier quite remarkably changing from Hotspur in the afternoon to Shallow in the evening. And through the years, one has seen the occasional production one is very glad to have seen. But in recent years, the best thing that I've seen, I remember going to the Henry Street Settlement Playhouse with my wife about 12 years ago, a traveling junior Vic company which from Australia. I wish I knew who the director was. It certainly was not this Mr. Boyd, the Australian, whose Midsummer Night's Dream horror is about to come upon us here in New York. It has been in London.
And that's about sex between a woman and a donkey.
This is all about bestiality, he thinks. The Jan Cott Shakespeare, as it were. I thought we were done with that tiresomeness with Peter Brook a while back, but evidently one never gets done with this sort of thing.
Why do you think directors insist on these high concept productions of Shakespeare? Is it that they don't really want to grapple with Shakespeare on his own terms, so they have to kind of avoid it by setting it in some cockamamie locale?
Why they don't think it's relevant?
They are professionals in a profession which, like all professions, has its own rituals and its own traditions. It has its own agon or contest with itself. I cannot pretend to understand it from the outside, since I know nothing about it whatsoever, except as a spectator. There must be a pressure upon them to conform, and then to go beyond that conforming, but within certain parameters. It certainly is no longer a question of even pretending to be faithful to the text of the play. Indeed, I have heard it argued, and they will say, well, probably Shakespeare himself was not faithful to the text of the play. The answer to that, of course, is given in Hamlet, where Hamlet, clearly as Shakespeare's surrogate, speaking to the players, says, "Speak the speech as it was written." And obviously Shakespeare had suffered a great deal from that there is a tradition, which is very probably true, that the comedian Will Kemp, who was, Shakespeare's first great clown or fool figure, later to be replaced to Shakespeare's great relief by Robin Armin, that Kemp was uncontrollable and pretty nearly drove Shakespeare mad until finally the ultimate quarrel and Kemp had to depart from the company.
This still goes on in the theater today, by the way, these fights
sure.
between the actors and the
Yes,
writers
yes,
over running
I'm
free
sure
with the
of that.
lines.
But I can only talk about it from the outside. I can only talk about it as someone who, when he's dragged into a theater to see a Shakespearean production, usually manages to leave by intermission. And if I can inconspicuously do it, being a fat old fellow, it's difficult to be inconspicuous, especially if one's movements are clumsy. But sometimes I've tried to leave before that.
All those devastated actors. There goes Harold Bloom out the door.
Well,
I want to ask you, coming back to your book, on the two great characters for you, Falstaff and Hamlet.
Well,
I love Falstaff too, but I would never...
there are surely, as everybody would agree, perhaps 8 to a dozen
Sure.
figures in Shakespeare.
But you put Falstaff
of
and
enormous
Hamlet
dimension. I think
forward.
Falstaff and Hamlet, I think you would probably have to add Rosalind and Cleopatra.
And you have Iago inventing
You would certainly
Satan.
have to
Yes.
add Iago. You would certainly have to add Macbeth. With Lear, there's a real problem because he is incommensurate. He can't really be talked about in terms of anybody else. But with the other 7 or 8, they have a fecundity. They have something in their language which breaks through even Shakespearean.
Well, you have a marvelous phrase you used to describe them, that they got away from Shakespeare. They got away from the play in some ways. They've broken out of the theater to become three-dimensional personalities in their own right, as real as we are.
Well, certainly it's very difficult to be as real as either Hamlet or Falstaff. There are a few other such figures in literature, of course. There are in Cervantes, Shakespeare's exact contemporary, the Don and Sancho. There are perhaps 2 or 3 other figures in subsequent literature, though not many. But there is something very disconcerting about Falstaff and Hamlet in particular. You could argue that both Rosalind and Cleopatra have a power of consciousness and of wit, and so indeed does Iago in a very savage mode, which veritably rivals both the scope of consciousness and the power of wit in Hamlet and in Falstaff. It's, I think, something else about those 2 figures. Enormous as, it could be argued that the 2 parts of Henry IV taken together is as astonishing a thing as Shakespeare ever did, as perfect a work as he ever did. Enormous as that 10-act structure is, Falstaff is too large for it. He will not be confined by it. Hamlet is Shakespeare's longest single play. It's nearly 4,000 lines long. So much so that it's almost unplayable because to do it, right through might give you about close to 4 hours of actual playing time. But again, Hamlet is too large for the play. And there's also the disconcerting sensation that one gets when you really read deeply, either in the Henry IV plays or in Hamlet, that somehow crazily, and I can only put this in an almost primitive and deliberately, I think, quite unsophisticated way, the peculiar sensation that Falstaff and Hamlet are, as it were, real people who've somehow been dropped into these plays, and the plays, while very powerful, are not quite right for them. They are too considerable for it. Hamlet, for one thing, has an authorial consciousness, which is more than peculiar for a fictive being. I mean, somehow the implicit laws of representation should not allow for the possibility of a fictive being so persuading you that he or she has an authorial consciousness that you're prepared to quote the figure the way you would quote, say, Emerson or Montaigne or Freud or Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or so on, as though this were an authority on 50 different subjects, ranging from envy to despair to mourning to love or disillusionment or whatever. Very peculiar phenomenon. And indeed, Shakespeare makes perfectly clear that in the revision of the so-called murder of Gonzago into what Hamlet calls the mousetrap, Hamlet has written much more than the, whatever he says, the 12 or 15 lines that he wants the player king to memorize. He has obviously written that astonishing speech that ends, but orderly to end where I begun, our wills and fates do so contrary run that our devices all are overthrown. Our thoughts are ours, their ends none of our own. A speech, I would think, almost impossible to take in through the ear if you're hearing it in a theater, no matter how many times. And also think of what Shakespeare does with Falstaff. I remember spending some time in the book, to the perplexity of some reviewers, pointing out Falstaff's amazing obsession with that very frightening parable of Jesus concerning a certain dives, as the medieval Latin puts it, or a rich man and the poor leper, Lazarus, not the man raised from the dead, but quite a different fellow. 3 times Falstaff gives you an extended allusion to that parable. Then it seems to be enacted at the very close of the second part of Henry IV, when Falstaff is down on his knees and the king, attired in coronation purple, is indeed rejecting him. And then it comes back again in an amazingly twisted but unmistakable form in Mistress Quickly's remarkable account of the death of Falstaff in Henry V, where she says of him, he's in Arthur's bosom, which is a transposition of the Abraham's bosom of that particular parable. In a novel, whether by Dostoevsky or Joyce or Proust or whoever, that kind of thing we could become accustomed to. But these are stage plays. How is the auditor in the theater supposed to absorb these obsessive allusions on the part of Falstaff, who is clearly a multi-dimensional figure, who is not even a 3-dimensional figure, but goes into further dimensions? I suppose the answer is that in spite of what nearly everybody who has been dealing with Shakespeare for at least the whole of the 20th century has insisted upon telling us, when they keep telling us again and again, oh, he didn't care to be read at all, you know, it's absolutely not true. Quite clearly that can only be read. Quite clearly that great speech of the player king can only be read. And quite clearly Shakespeare was being read. The first part of Henry IV came out in a whole rash of authorized quartos as well as unauthorized. They had to keep reprinting them. There was a real audience for it.
He was a bestseller of his time.
Well, pretty nearly. And the same thing happened with Hamlet, though not quite on that scale. It's no good condescending to Shakespeare, I guess is the heart of what I'm saying. I mean, Goethe was quite right. Shakespeare und keine Ende is the best possible motto you can bring to it.
Well, the book is terrific, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human by Harold Bloom. I keep it right next to my volume of Shakespeare, constantly going back and forth between the two of them. Mr. Bloom, thank you very much for being our guest tonight on Theater Talk.
Thank you.
I would to a bedtime, Hal, and all well.
Why, thou owest God a debt.
'Tis not due yet. I would be loath to pay him before his day. What need I be so forward with him that calls not on me? Well, no matter. Honor pricks me on.
Yes, how if honor
prick me off when I come on her then. Can honor set to a leg? No. Or an arm? No. Or take away the grief of a wound? No. Honor hath no skill in surgery then? No. What is honor? Here. A trim reckoning. Who hath it? He that died a Wednesday. Doth he feel it? No. 'Tis insensible and yea to the dead. But will it not live with the living? No. Why? Detraction will not suffer it, therefore I'll none of it. Honor is a mere scotch. And so ends my catechism.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Friedrich Loewe Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, and public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
Playbill Online is the official website of Theater Talk and the home of the Playbill Club, providing exciting opportunities for theater lovers. We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.